Maybe we should check if Margaret remembers how to use Slack, or if she's still writing memos on a typewriter. That's what I overheard Trevor Walsh, our VP of Operations, say during a leadership team meeting in March 2024, getting laughs from the younger executives as he mocked my age and suggested I was technologically incompetent, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed being 47 years old made me obsolete in a tech company culture that worshipped youth. Typewriter. I'd been Chief Operations Officer at Vertex Software for 23 years, managing the operational infrastructure that allowed developers to build products and salespeople to close deals, maintaining the institutional knowledge that prevented costly mistakes, and ensuring business continuity through 6 different CEOs and countless strategic pivots. But according to Trevor, our 32-year-old VP who'd been promoted 9 months earlier after 3 years at the company, my decades of experience were liabilities rather than assets, and making jokes about my age was acceptable workplace humor rather than the kind of discrimination that employment lawyers dream about. I'm Margaret Foster, and I sat in that conference room at Vertex Software listening to Trevor and others laugh about whether I could operate modern technology, while knowing exactly what my employment contract contained and exactly what would happen when the company tried to force out their longest-tenured executive without understanding the financial obligations they'd inherited from decisions made 23 years ago. 23 years, 4 months, and 9 days of building operational systems that allowed Vertex to grow from a 12-person startup to a publicly traded company with 800 employees and $300 million in annual revenue. And Trevor had decided my gray hair meant I was too old to understand software operations despite the fact that I'd been managing tech infrastructure since before he graduated from high school. I wasn't the founder who'd cashed out years ago or the CEO who made strategic decisions about product direction. I drove a 2019 Volvo XC60 with 61,000 miles on it and 23 years worth of company documents in archival boxes in my garage because I'd kept records of every major operational decision and contract negotiation that had shaped Vertex's history. I lived in a comfortable house in Boulder that I'd paid off years ago, with a home office containing binders documenting Vertex's evolution from startup chaos to public company discipline. I was methodical, protective of institutional knowledge, cautious about operational changes that might cause problems younger executives couldn't anticipate, and apparently fair game for age discrimination jokes from people who thought experience was less valuable than being able to reference the latest Silicon Valley management trends. The trouble had started 9 months earlier when Vertex Software had promoted Trevor Walsh to VP of Operations as part of a broader leadership refresh initiative. The board wanted younger executives who understood modern tech culture and could bring fresh energy to leadership. Trevor was 32, had worked at Vertex for 3 years in program management roles, and had spent his previous career at venture-backed startups where he developed strong opinions about how tech companies should operate. Trevor had that aggressive youth culture mindset, talking about disrupting legacy processes, challenging institutional assumptions, and not being constrained by how things have always been done. That sounded innovative in board presentations but ignored the reality that some processes existed for good reasons and some institutional knowledge prevented expensive mistakes. Trevor's first major initiative had been questioning operational procedures that I'd implemented over 2 decades. In his view, many of our processes were legacy overhead that slowed down decision-making. He particularly disliked our financial approval processes. Our vendor contract review procedures, and our operational risk assessments, all systems I'd built to prevent the kinds of problems that could sink companies. By November 2023, Trevor had begun making comments about my age in leadership meetings. At first they were subtle, references to generational perspectives on technology adoption, or jokes about digital natives versus digital immigrants. By January 2024, the comments became more direct, suggestions that I didn't understand modern software development practices, implications that my cautious approach reflected outdated thinking, an increasingly open mockery of my age as if being 47 made me incompetent. The March 2024 typewriter comment was just the most recent example. What Trevor and the other young executives didn't understand, and what they'd never bothered to learn, was that my employment contract contained provisions that had been negotiated 23 years earlier when Vertex was a struggling startup desperate to retain experienced operational talent. In 2001, when I joined Vertex, the company had 12 people operating out of a shared office space with an uncertain runway and questionable prospects. They needed someone with operational expertise but couldn't afford market-rate compensation. The founder, David Morrison, had offered me a deal, below market base salary of $65,000, but with a comprehensive benefits package including a defined benefit pension plan that would vest after 20 years of service. Defined benefit pensions were already becoming rare in 2001, but David had structured this as a retention tool. If I stayed 20 years, I'd receive a pension calculated as 60% of my final 3-year average salary, payable annually starting at age 50. The pension was backed by company funds and couldn't be reduced or eliminated once vested. At the time, 60% of a $65,000 salary seemed like a modest retirement benefit that might be worth something if Vertex survived long enough for me to vest. But Vertex had survived. More than survived. We'd gone public in 2014, grown substantially, and my compensation had increased significantly over 2 decades. By 2024, as Chief Operations Officer, my base salary was $385,000. My 3-year average salary was $372,000. And my pension, which had vested in 2021 after 20 years of service, would pay me 60% of $372,223,000 annually starting at age 50. The pension calculation was locked in by my employment contract and couldn't be changed without my consent. Even if Vertex terminated me, I'd still receive the pension starting at age 50. The company actuaries had estimated the total liability for my pension at approximately $5.8 million, the present value of annual payments from age 50 through life expectancy. What made this particularly expensive for Vertex was that defined benefit pensions had become extinct in tech companies. Nobody offered them anymore. And the accounting rules for public companies required that pension obligations appear as liabilities on financial statements. My $5.8 million pension obligation sat on Vertex's balance sheet as a reminder of decisions made 23 years ago when the company was desperate enough to offer generous future benefits in lieu of current cash compensation. Trevor and the other young executives didn't know the details of my employment contract. They knew I'd been with the company a long time, but they didn't understand the financial implications of that tenure. The company's compensation team and board knew about the pension, but they'd never discussed it openly because it was an embarrassing example of how expensive old employment agreements could become. Now about 79% of you think I'm about to threaten Trevor with an age discrimination lawsuit, and you're wrong. Subscribe, because what actually happens is that companies trying to push out expensive older employees discover that employment contracts have consequences, and sometimes the most costly person to lose is the one you've been mocking for being too old. After the March typewriter comment, I documented the incident in an email to myself with date, time, attendees, and exact words. I also began documenting other age-related comments and discriminatory treatment. I wasn't planning to sue, I was building a record in case things escalated. Over the next 3 months, Trevor increased pressure to marginalize me. In April, he reorganized operations to reduce my direct reports. In May, he excluded me from strategic planning meetings where operational decisions were being made. In June, he sent an email to the leadership team suggesting that Vertex needed fresh operational leadership that understood modern tech company dynamics. On July 8, 2024, Trevor and Vertex's CEO, Amanda Chen, called me into a meeting. Amanda explained that the board had decided to restructure the COO role. They wanted to transition operations leadership to someone with contemporary experience in high-growth tech environments. They were offering me a transition plan. I could stay through December 2024 in an advisory role with full compensation, or I could accept an immediate separation package including 1 year of salary continuation and accelerated vesting of unvested stock options. I asked whether this decision was related to Trevor's comments about my age. Amanda insisted it wasn't. This was about operational strategy and leadership capabilities. I pointed out that Trevor had repeatedly made age-discriminatory comments including the March typewriter joke, the January digital immigrant reference, and multiple other instances I'd documented. Amanda said those comments were poor word choices, but didn't reflect the decision-making about my role. I asked about my pension. Amanda confirmed that regardless of which transition option I chose, my vested pension would be paid starting at age 50 per my employment contract. I was 47, so payments would begin in 3 years. I took 2 weeks to consider the offer. During that time, I consulted with an employment attorney who reviewed my documentation of age discrimination and explained that I had a strong case if I wanted to pursue litigation. But litigation would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Instead, I made a different choice. On July 22, I told Amanda I'd accept the immediate separation package, 1 year of salary continuation plus accelerated stock vesting. I'd leave Vertex at the end of July 2024. Vertex announced my departure on July 24 as a mutual decision and thanked me for 23 years of service. Trevor was promoted to Chief Operations Officer, inheriting my responsibilities. The young leadership team celebrated bringing modern operational leadership to the role. What happened next wasn't something I caused, it was natural consequences of institutional knowledge walking out the door. In August 2024, Trevor made his first major operational decision, moving Vertex's data infrastructure to a new cloud provider to save costs. I'd been managing relationships with our existing provider for 15 years and had negotiated specific terms that protected Vertex's interests. Trevor didn't review those contract terms before initiating the migration. 3 weeks into the migration, Vertex's existing provider invoked an early termination clause that I'd negotiated out of the standard contract years ago, but only for our primary data services, not for secondary services that Trevor had assumed were covered. The termination triggered a $320,000 penalty that Trevor hadn't budgeted for. In September, Trevor eliminated several operational risk review procedures that I'd implemented, characterizing them as legacy bureaucracy. One of those procedures was vendor insurance verification, checking that vendors had adequate insurance before engaging them for critical services. In October, a vendor Trevor had hired to manage office facilities caused significant property damage during a renovation project. The vendor had minimal insurance. Vertex sued but recovered only a fraction of the $400,000 in damages. In November, Trevor made changes to Vertex's financial approval processes, increasing spending authority limits for department heads to empower faster decision-making. Within 2 weeks, 3 departments overspent their quarterly budgets by a combined $600,000 on commitments that couldn't be easily reversed. By December 2024, Trevor's operational decisions had created approximately $1.3 million in unexpected costs, penalties, damages, overruns, that I would have prevented through the cautious processes he'd eliminated as legacy overhead. In January 2025, Vertex's board conducted a year-end financial review. The CFO presented analysis showing that operational costs had increased significantly in the 6 months since my departure, driven largely by problems that seemed preventable with better institutional knowledge and risk management. One board member asked Amanda Chin directly, when we approved Margaret Foster's separation, did we account for the value of her institutional knowledge? These operational problems, the contract penalties, the vendor issues, the budget overruns, are these the kind of things she would have prevented? Amanda acknowledged that yes, many of these problems reflected gaps in institutional knowledge that I'd maintained. The board member asked about the financial impact of losing that knowledge. The CFO explained that between the one-time costs from Trevor's mistakes and the ongoing expense of my pension obligation, the decision to replace me was looking increasingly expensive. The board asked about my pension. The CFO provided details. Starting in 2027 when I turned 50, Vertex would pay me $223,000 annually for life. The total liability on the balance sheet was $5.8 million. This had always been known, but the timing was unfortunate. Vertex was now paying this obligation for someone who wasn't providing any value to the company, while simultaneously incurring costs from the absence of her expertise. One board member did the math out loud. So we're paying Margaret's pension, which costs us over $5 million in present value, while spending an additional $1.3 million fixing problems that probably wouldn't have occurred if she was still here. And we made this decision because Trevor convinced us we needed younger operational leadership. The board directed Amanda to review the circumstances of my departure, including Trevor's age-related comments. They also asked for analysis of whether Vertex had adequate institutional knowledge retention and whether Trevor was the right person to lead operations. In February 2025, Amanda called me. Margaret, the board has been reviewing what's happened since your departure. They're concerned about operational costs and institutional knowledge gaps. They're asking whether you'd consider returning to Vertex in a senior advisory role. I asked what the role would entail. Amanda explained they wanted me to work with Trevor to implement better operational controls, document institutional knowledge, and prevent the kinds of problems that had occurred in the past 6 months. The role would be part-time, 20 hours per week, with compensation of $150,000 annually. I declined. Amanda, Trevor spent a year making comments about my age and suggesting I was incompetent because I was 47. Now you want me to come back part-time to fix the problems he created while he keeps the COO title? That's not a role I'm interested in. Amanda said she understood. In March 2025, the board terminated Trevor Walsh as COO. They appointed an interim COO and began searching for experienced operational leadership, specifically someone with long tenure at tech companies who understood both modern practices and institutional knowledge management. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Vertex had pushed out a 23-year veteran COO with deep institutional knowledge because she was too old, promoted a 32-year-old who mocked her age, and then spent a year discovering that experience actually mattered and that some legacy processes existed for good reasons. In April 2025, I ran into Trevor at a tech industry conference. He was working as an independent operations consultant, trying to find his next role after being terminated from Vertex. Margaret, I heard about what happened after you left Vertex. The board ended up removing me as COO. I guess some of the changes I made didn't work out as planned. I looked at him directly. Trevor, you spent a year making jokes about my age, suggesting I didn't understand technology because I was 47, and pushing me out because you wanted modern operational leadership. Then you eliminated risk management processes I'd built over 20 years, made expensive mistakes I would have prevented, and cost Vertex over $1 million in problems that existed specifically because institutional knowledge walked out the door. That's not changes that didn't work out, that's arrogance meeting consequences. Trevor tried to defend himself. I was trying to modernize operations and eliminate legacy overhead that slowed us down. I responded, you eliminated procedures without understanding why they existed. The vendor insurance verification you cut as bureaucracy? That prevented exactly the kind of uninsured contractor damage that cost Vertex $400,000. The contract review process you eliminated as legacy overhead? That would have caught the termination penalty that cost $320,000. You thought experience was overhead because you didn't understand the difference between process and protection. And you made jokes about typewriters while demonstrating that youth doesn't replace knowledge, it just costs more when it fails. Trevor walked away. In 2027, I'll turn 50 and my pension payments will begin, $223,000 annually paid by Vertex for the rest of my life. The company I helped build for 23 years will be sending me that check every year, a permanent reminder that employment contracts made when companies are desperate can become very expensive when companies are successful. And that the person they mocked for being too old had a contract that aged better than their judgment. The math is simple, really. Trevor thought getting rid of me would save money. What it actually did was lock in $5.8 million in pension obligations while eliminating the institutional knowledge that prevented expensive mistakes. His age jokes cost Vertex more than my entire career salary. That's not modern leadership, that's expensive ignorance wearing youth as a credential. You want to push out your experienced people? Go ahead. But read their contracts first. And maybe ask yourself whether that person's legacy thinking has been preventing problems you don't even know exist yet. Because the thing about institutional knowledge is that you only notice its absence when everything starts breaking. And by then, the person who knew how things worked is gone, probably collecting a very nice pension while watching your company learn expensive lessons about what experience was actually worth. Drop a comment if you've ever been the oldest person in the room who turned out to be right. Subscribe if you're tired of watching companies worship youth while ignoring the value of actually knowing what you're doing. And remember, age discrimination is illegal, but even when it's legal, it's often just expensive stupidity wearing a hoodie.